Welcome to Latchkey History. And welcome to Old West Outlaws, the Unfiltered History. When we hear the word outlaw, a preconceived notion forms almost instantly. A lone rider on the horizon, his face hidden in shadow. A revolver hangs on his hip. He lives beyond the rules and answers to no one. If he wants something, he takes it. It's an image so familiar it now feels ancient. But this image was constructed carefully and deliberately. Long after the posse left town, the gun smoke cleared and the graves were filled on Boot Hill. Foregoing all the overdone Hollywood movies and dime store novels, the Old West was real. Its violence was real. Its hunger, boredom, ambition, and fear were real. And its outlaws were real men, living in conditions that rarely resembled the stories that were later told about them. Legend simplifies what history complicates, and nowhere is that more obvious than in the lives of the men we now remember as outlaws. Men like Jesse James or Billy the Kid, whose names now feel larger and more monumental than the brief, unstable lives they actually lived. The popular story tells us these men were rebels, pushed to the margins by corrupt systems and powerful elites. They are largely framed as unwilling criminals, driven to violence by severe injustice rather than choice. The historical record, however, offers a much colder and direct explanation. Most outlaws were not fighting a system. They were not making statements. Instead, they were often young men with few skills, little education, and fewer prospects. Many were also raised around instability and violence, an environment that taught them a show of force generally solves problems quickly. Many came from frontier communities, where the economy was built around seasonal work and uncertain wages. Many saw being an outlaw as their only option for fast money and immediate results, even if it was typically paired with a short future and lifespan. Another enduring myth is the outlaw stood alone, a solitary figure relying solely on grit and courage. The reality, however, was isolation was dangerous in the Old West. Nearly all outlaws operated in groups. Gangs formed around family ties, friendships, and shared desperation. Brothers rode together, cousins planned robberies together, and many childhood companions trusted one another long after the trust should have expired. Even men remembered as lone legends depended heavily on their fellow outlaws. Butch Cassidy rarely worked alone. He relied on partners, scouts, and escape routes that he mapped out long before a robbery ever took place. Crime in the Old West was rarely individualistic. More often than not, relationships were cooperative and fragile. Loyalty was also heavily depended on. Loyalty that would often fail at the worst possible moment. Popular culture also insists that these men were exceptional and magnificent gunfighters. They were masters of the quick draw who lived and died by their skill with a gun. This image, however, owes far more to books and movies than to reality. Real gunfights were chaotic, terrifying, and short. They happened suddenly, often at close range, and ended before anyone ever fully understood what was happening. There were very few, if any, elegant showdowns at high noon. Instead, there were missed shots, stray bullets, screaming horses, and civilians caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Reputation often trumped accuracy. A man believed to be dangerous often survived because others hesitated. Even legendary figures like Wild Bill Hickok lived in a world where one ambush or careless moment could erase a lifetime of legend. The outlaw mythos suggests these men targeted banks, stagecoaches, and railroads as acts of rebellion against distant controlling powers. In reality, their motives were far more personal and practical. Stagecoaches and trains carried mail, and in that era, the mail often carried money. That money was the lifeblood of the frontier. Payrolls for miners, wages for farmers, and the hard-earned savings of families. However, it was also the primary source of income for outlaws themselves. When a robbery occurred, it was rarely a rich corporation that suffered. More often, it meant laborers losing their pay and families losing money they could not easily replace. There was no insurance, no refund, and no recourse. Once the money was taken, it was simply gone. Even well-known gangs, including that of Jesse James, routinely stole from communities that were already just struggling to survive. Also, banks in the Old West were not monuments to wealth. They were repositories of trust. Frontier banks held the combined resources of entire towns: payroll funds, mortgages, crop earnings, and personal savings. When a bank was robbed, businesses failed, workers went unpaid, and families were ruined. The damage didn't magically disappear when the outlaw rode away. It echoed for years, long after the robbery faded into obscurity. Entire families were sometimes left destitute and never rebounded. Law enforcement of the time was neither omnipresent nor particularly effective. Sheriffs were often part-time officials with limited authority, little funding, and enormous personal risk. Many had other professions such as farms to run or trades to practice. They also often had families to support. Pursuing armed criminals across vast stretches of open territory was not viewed as heroic. It was viewed as suicidal. Outlaws knew this and exploited it. They would move regularly, cross jurisdictions, and rely on the slow spread of information across enormous distances. Justice moved much slower in those days. When outlaws were finally caught, it was rarely through dramatic confrontations. More often, they were undone by their own behavior. They talked too much, they drank too much. They trusted the wrong people. Success bred carelessness, and carelessness bred betrayal. Reward money eroded loyalty, and many gangs collapsed from within. Cole Younger survived years of pursuit, only to be worn down by injury, exhaustion, and betrayal rather than heroic defeat. The way outlaws died has been mythologized into something almost poetic: blazing shootouts and defiant last stands. Those endings were rare. Many outlaws were shot in the back, killed while sleeping, or ambushed when they believed themselves safe. Billy the Kid did not die in a dramatic duel beneath an open sky. His death was sudden, close, and deeply unromantic, which is often the truest version of history. There is also a persistent belief that the West was largely a place void of law, a place where chaos ruled and violence was inevitable. In reality, most frontier towns were desperate for order. Knowing law enforcement was unreliable, communities sometimes organized posses, vigilance committees, and informal defense groups. The presence of an outlaw was not exciting or glamorous to the people who lived there. It was a threat to livelihoods, families, and stability. Outlaws survived briefly, not because law was absent, but because it took time for legal systems to adapt to rapidly expanding territory. And when they did adapt, the window for outlaw success closed quickly. Why does the outlaw remain one of the most enduring figures in American mythology? Not because they deserve admiration, but because legends serve a purpose. They simplify the past, turning complicated individuals into symbols. The outlaw over time has morphed into a stand-in for freedom, rebellion, and defiance in a world that often feels constrained. By reshaping these men into heroes or anti-heroes, we avoid confronting the harm they caused and the communities they destabilized. The truth is, most outlaws were not purely evil and ruthless, nor misunderstood champions. They were human beings just like us, shaped by poverty, violence, opportunity, and a series of choices that narrowed most of their futures with every step. Some did attempt to leave crime behind, hoping to disappear into quieter lives under new names. Most, however, never lived long enough for a second try. The Old West was not a hardline moral battlefield between good and evil. It was a place where survival came first. Ethics followed distantly behind, and stories were written only after the dust settled. Outlaws did not become legends because of who they truly were. They became legends because of who later generations wanted them to be. Beneath the dust, the gun smoke, and the carefully constructed myths, these men were ordinary in the most unsettling way. They were flawed, afraid, sometimes charismatic, often cruel, and always temporary. The West did not belong to them. It belonged to the people who endured their presence and rebuilt after they were gone. And that is where the legend ends. and real history begins. Thanks for watching Old West Outlaws, the Unfiltered History. And see you next time on Latchkey History.